She was the heavily corseted, heavily mocked daughter of a railroad baron. He was a man who lived off the grid before there was a grid. When her father handed over her dowry and her hand to a rough-hewn stranger just to hide her away, high society laughed. They thought she was being sent to her grave, but they didn't know the mountains, and they certainly didn't know the man who called them home. Here is the story of how a cast-off daughter became a mountain queen. The whalebone corset bit into Beatrice's ribs, a familiar and breathless agony. She sat perfectly still on the velvet settee in her father's Denver parlor. If she moved, the silk of her dress would pull taut, and the seams would groan, and her father would look at her with that expression, the one that said she was a bad investment. Cornelius Pendleton stood by the fireplace, puffing a cigar. He didn't look at her. He looked at the man standing awkwardly on the imported Persian rug. Gideon Hayes brought the smell of raw earth, pine sap, and wood smoke into the suffocatingly perfumed room. He was a massive wall of a man, dressed in worn canvas and dark leather. A thick beard hid the lower half of his face, but his eyes were a startling pale gray. They missed nothing. He held his wide-brimmed hat in massive, calloused hands. "The deed to the valley is yours, Hayes," Cornelius said, his voice a dry rasp. 500 acres of prime timber. In exchange, you grant my surveyors right of way through the pass. He paused, tapping ash into the fireplace. "And you take the girl." Beatrice stared at her lap. Her hands, thick and dimpled, twisted the fabric of her skirt. She was 24. To the society pages, she was the unfortunate Pendleton heiress, a girl who ate her feelings while her father built an empire. Too large to be fashionable, too quiet to be charming, and too heavy to ride side saddle. She was a stain on a legacy of perfection. "I don't need a wife," Gideon said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together at the bottom of a river. "You need that valley," Cornelius countered. "And I need her gone before the governor's ball next month. It's a package deal. You want the land, you take my daughter. Take her up to that godforsaken cabin of yours. Keep her fed. Keep her out of sight. The dowry alone will buy you enough traps and rifles to last a lifetime." It was a cruel joke. Cornelius was tossing his heavy, useless daughter to a mountain savage just to finalize a railroad expansion and save himself the embarrassment of her presence. Beatrice waited for the stranger to laugh. She waited for the disgust to twist his bearded face. Gideon looked at her. He didn't sneer. He just looked. He took in the tight, ridiculous dress, the flushed cheeks, the sheer, undeniable mass of her. Beatrice shrank inward, wishing the velvet settee would swallow her whole. "We leave in an hour," Gideon said. He turned and walked out of the parlor. Beatrice didn't cry. Crying made her face blotchy and her father angry. She simply stood, the corset digging a fresh trench into her waist, and went to gather her things. The wagon ride out of Denver was an exercise in physical torture. The wagon was essentially a wooden box on wheels, built for hauling freight, not passengers. Gideon had thrown a couple of heavy woolen blankets over a sack of grain for her to sit on. As they left the city limits, the roads turned from cobblestone to rutted dirt. Every jolt sent a shockwave up Beatrice's spine. Her flesh jiggled and ached with the relentless motion. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, trapping the heat beneath her heavy layers of silk and petticoats. Sweat pooled beneath her breasts and trickled down her back. She stared at the back of Gideon's coat. He sat on the bench, driving the draft horses with quiet clicks of his tongue. He hadn't spoken a word to her since they left. By mid-afternoon, Beatrice was lightheaded. She hadn't eaten breakfast, terrified of her father's glaring at the table, and she certainly wasn't going to ask this stranger for food. She knew the rules. Fat girls didn't get to be hungry. The wagon hit a particularly deep pothole. Beatrice's teeth clacked together hard enough to taste blood. She let out a small, involuntary whimper. Gideon pulled back on the reins. The wagon rolled to a halt in the shade of a massive cottonwood tree. The silence left behind by the rattling wheels was deafening. He tied off the reins and climbed into the back of the wagon. Beatrice braced herself. This was it. He was going to complain about her weight shifting the wagon. He was going to tell her she took up too much room. Instead, he reached out and pulled a heavy wooden crate close to her, creating a makeshift backrest. "Lean back," he said. She obeyed, the rigid posture she'd maintained for hours finally breaking. Relief flooded her lower back. Gideon rummaged in a canvas sack and pulled out a canteen, a block of hard cheese, and thick slabs of dried meat. He set them on her lap. "Eat," he instructed. I'm not hungry," she lied, her face burning. Her stomach immediately betrayed her with a loud, hollow growl. Gideon didn't smile, but the corner of his eye crinkled. "Up where we're going, the cold burns through meat and bone. You don't eat, you don't stay warm. I didn't take you on just to bury you in a month. Eat the cheese." He turned his back to her, giving her privacy, and went to check the horse's hooves. Beatrice stared at the food. Slowly, she picked up the cheese and took a bite. It was sharp and salty, and the best thing she had ever tasted. When Gideon returned to the bench, he tossed a heavy iron wrench into the back. "Take that," he said over his shoulder. "Reach around back. There are metal clasps on the top and bottom of that contraption you're wearing. Hit them with the wrench." Beatrice froze. "My corset? It's cutting off your wind. You're breathing like a winded horse. We start climbing elevation tomorrow. If you can't fill your lungs, you'll pass out. Break it off." "It's Parisian," she whispered, horrified but desperately tempted. "It cost $40. "It's a cage," Gideon said. He snapped the reins. "Break it." As the wagon rattled forward, Beatrice picked up the heavy wrench. She reached around her back, fumbling blindly for the metal clasp. She positioned the heavy iron tool, and with a sudden, vicious surge of resentment toward her father, the city, and the silk dress, she struck it. The clasp snapped. The rigid whalebone gave way. Beatrice gasped, pulling in the first full, deep breath she had taken in a decade. The mountain air was sharp, smelling of pine needles and dust. It tasted like freedom. The cabin sat in the cradle of a high mountain pass, flanked by jagged peaks that scraped the sky. It wasn't a romantic frontier home. It was a fortress built against the elements. Thick, unpeeled logs were chinked with mud and dried grass. The roof was heavy slate. It looked immovable. Gideon halted the team. The horses blew out plumes of white breath in the chilling evening air. "We're here," he said. He jumped down from the bench and walked to the back of the wagon. He didn't offer a dramatic hand, nor did he try to sweep her into his arms to carry her over the threshold. Beatrice appreciated the pragmatism. At over 200 pounds, the last thing she wanted was the humiliation of watching a man struggle to lift her. Instead, He dragged a sturdy wooden step box from the wagon bed and placed it securely on the dirt. He stood by, offering a solid forearm as a rail. Beatrice gripped his arm. It felt like grabbing a branch of an oak tree. She stepped down, her knees trembling from the long journey. Her dress, now loose and awkward, without its rigid underpinnings, hung on her heavy frame. She felt sloppy, exposed. Gideon unlocked the heavy plank door and pushed it open. Beatrice stepped inside. The air was stale, smelling of cold ash, dried herbs, and old leather. There was one main room. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall. An iron stove stood in the corner. There was a rough-hewn table, a single wooden chair, and in the corner, a bed frame built directly into the logs, piled high with bear and wolf pelts. One bed. Beatrice's chest tightened. The reality of her situation came crashing down. She was legally bound to this stranger, a man who owned her because her father essentially threw her in as a bonus prize for a real estate deal. She knew what men expected of wives. She just couldn't fathom this man looking at her flesh and feeling anything but revulsion. Gideon walked past her, striking a match to light a kerosene lantern. Golden light spilled across the rough floorboards. "I'll fetch the supplies," he said, turning back to the door. "Firewood's in the bin next to the hearth. You know how to lay a fire?" No," she admitted. At home, the maids handled the fires before she even woke up. Gideon nodded once. No judgment. "I'll show you later." He spent the next hour hauling crates, sacks of flour, and their meager belongings into the cabin. Beatrice stood awkwardly in the center of the room, unsure of what to do with her hands. She felt massive. She felt like she was taking up all the air in the small space. When the wagon was empty, Gideon brought in an armful of wood and expertly built a fire. The flames crackled, throwing heat into the biting cold of the room. He pointed to the bed. "You take the pelts," he said. Beatrice blinked. "And you?" He kicked out a heavy canvas bedroll near the hearth. "I sleep by the fire. Keeps me close if the embers jump." "But we're married." The words tasted like ash. Gideon stopped unlacing his boots and looked up at her. The firelight caught the gray of his eyes. "I bought a valley, Beatrice. Your father decided to attach a person to the deed. I didn't bring you up here to use you. You're safe in this house. You sleep in the bed." He went back to his boots. Beatrice stared at him, a strange, heavy lump forming in her throat. No one had ever called her safe before. The first week was a clumsy dance of survival and silence. Beatrice realized quickly that her city habits were useless. But she was observant, and she was desperate not to be a burden. She watched Gideon cook. Simple, hearty meals of beans, salt pork, and cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet. By the fourth day, when he went out to check his trap lines, she took over. She found wild onions hanging from the rafters and dug into the supply of dried potatoes. When Gideon returned at dusk, dusted with snow and smelling of cold wind, the cabin was warm, and a rich, thick stew was bubbling on the stove. He took off his coat, sat at the table, and ate 3 bowls without speaking. When he finished, he set his spoon down. "Better than mine," he grunted. It was the highest praise she had ever received. But the physical reality of her size remained a daily friction. The single wooden chair at the table was built for a smaller frame. When Beatrice sat in it to peel potatoes, the spindly legs groaned under her weight, and the narrow arms dug painfully into her hips. She spent most of her time standing or sitting on the edge of the sturdy bed to avoid breaking the furniture. On the 8th morning, Gideon left earlier than usual. He didn't take his rifle. He took an axe and a saw. He was gone all day. Beatrice kept the fire burning and mended a tear in one of his heavy wool shirts. She found herself enjoying the quiet. There were no sneering debutantes here, no mirrors reflecting her failures, just the wind and the wood. Gideon returned as the sun dipped behind the peaks. He dragged something heavy and cumbersome through the front door. Beatrice stood up from the bed. It was a chair. But unlike the flimsy thing at the table, this was a throne of thick, unpeeled pine branches. The seat was incredibly wide, woven tight with thick strips of cured rawhide. The back was angled perfectly, and the armrests were broad and flat. The joints were bound tight with leather thongs and reinforced with wooden pegs. It looked strong enough to hold a boulder. Gideon dragged it to the side of the hearth, right where the heat pooled perfectly. He brushed some sawdust off the armrest. "The old chair is rotting," he said gruffly, not looking at her. "Needed something for the fire." Beatrice looked at the wide seat. She looked at the narrow, perfectly fine old chair still sitting by the table. Then she looked at Gideon's hands. They were covered in fresh sap and minor nicks from the tools. He had spent his entire day building a piece of furniture specifically designed for her body. "Try it," he said, shifting his weight. Beatrice walked over. She turned and lowered herself into the chair. The rawhide seat gave slightly, conforming to her shape, then held firm. The broad arms caught her elbows perfectly. It didn't squeak. It didn't groan. It simply held her. She sat there, staring at the roaring fire, and for the first time since she was a little girl, Beatrice Worthington began to cry. She didn't sob out loud. The tears just spilled over her cheeks, hot and fast, soaking into the collar of her dress. Gideon frowned. He took a step forward, his large hands hovering awkwardly in the air. "Is a splinter loose? Did I cut the angle wrong on the back?" "No," Beatrice choked out, wiping her face with the back of her thick hand. "No, Gideon, it's perfect." He stared at her for a long moment, watching the firelight play off her tear-stained, rounded cheeks. Slowly, he reached out. His calloused thumb brushed away a tear near her jawline. The touch was startlingly gentle. "You take up space, Beatrice," he said, quietly. "Nothing wrong with taking up space. Out here, we build for the load. We don't complain about the weight." Winter did not creep into the valley. It slammed the door shut and locked it with ice. By November, the snow was waist deep. The jagged peaks turned into a white, blinding prison wall, cutting the cabin off from the rest of the world. In Denver, this was the season of the velvet-draped ballrooms and roaring parlor fires, where Beatrice would have been shoved into dark corners, a massive, silent shadow trying not to ruin the aesthetic of her father's gatherings. Here, there were no corners to hide in. There was only the fire, the cold, and Gideon. Her silk dresses had been packed away in a trunk at the foot of the bed. They were useless against the biting drafts that sneaked through the chinking. Instead, she wore Gideon's spare wool trousers, held up by heavy suspenders, and his thick flannel shirts. The rough fabric didn't pinch or squeeze. It draped over her broad shoulders and heavy hips with utilitarian grace. She felt solid. For the first time in her life, her clothes were meant to protect her, not contain her. She wasn't getting thin. The heavy mountain diet of venison fat, root vegetables, and thick breads ensured she kept her mass. But the softness that came from a lifetime of enforced stillness was giving way to something else. Her thick arms developed a dense, heavy muscle underneath the flesh from hauling iron skillets and chopping kindling. Her legs, carrying her substantial weight over uneven, snow-packed ground, grew like tree trunks. One bitter morning, the sky the color of bruised iron, Beatrice went out to the woodpile. The wind was howling, snatching the breath right out of her lungs. She loaded a heavy canvas sling with split pine, perhaps grabbing too much in her eagerness to get back to the hearth. She turned, her boots catching on a sheet of black ice buried under a dusting of fresh snow. Her feet went entirely out from under her. She hit the ground with a sickening, heavy thud that drove the air from her chest. The wood scattered into the snow. Beatrice lay there, staring up at the gray sky, waiting for the familiar, suffocating wave of humiliation. In her father's house, a fall was a catastrophe. It meant structural damage to furniture, horrified gasps from maids, and her father's cold, disgusted sneer. Like a dying cow, he had told her once when she tripped on a rug. The heavy cabin door swung open. Gideon stood on the porch, his rifle hanging loosely from one hand. He had heard the crash. Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut. She waited for the sigh. She waited for the irritation. The crunch of his boots in the snow stopped right beside her head. "You broke anything?" he asked. His voice was flat, carrying easily over the wind. "Just my pride," she wheezed, her cheeks burning hot against the freezing snow. "Pride doesn't keep you warm," he said. He didn't offer his hand. At first, the sting of that omission hit her hard. Was she too heavy? Did he not want to strain his back? Then, Gideon jammed his rifle stock first into a snowbank and crouched down beside her. "You're trying to walk on the ice like a city woman," he told her. "You're keeping your feet close together, trying to make yourself small. You can't do that out here." She opened her eyes. He was looking right at her, not with pity, with instruction. "You have mass, Beatrice," he said, his pale gray eyes intense. "Use it. Drop your center of gravity. Spread your feet wide. When you step, you drive your heel through the crust. You command the ground. You don't ask its permission. Now, roll to your knees." She listened. She rolled onto her hands and heavy knees, the snow soaking through her wool trousers. "Plant your right foot," he ordered. "Wide." She did. "Now push up. All your weight into that leg." She pushed. She didn't need him to haul her up. Her own legs, strong and sturdy, drove her upright. She stood there, panting, her boots planted shoulder-width apart, utterly balanced on the treacherous ice. Gideon nodded once. "Pick up your wood. Keep your stance wide." He turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving the door open for her. He hadn't laughed. He hadn't patronized her. He had simply taught her how to carry her own weight. That evening, the wind screamed against the slate roof, but inside, the fire roared. Beatrice sat in the massive wooden chair Gideon had built for her. She was trying to darn a sock, but her hands were raw and split from the cold and the rough bark of the firewood. Gideon was cleaning his revolver at the table. He stopped, the oily rag pausing over the cylinder. He watched her wince as the needle slipped and pricked her calloused thumb. He stood up, walked to a shelf, and pulled down a small tin. He came over to the hearth and knelt beside her massive chair. "Give me your hands," he said. She hesitated, then set the knitting aside and held them out. They were not delicate hands. They were thick, dimpled at the knuckles, and currently red and chapped. Gideon took them in his own. His hands were twice the size of hers, scarred and rough as sandstone. He scooped a dollop of yellowish, sharp-smelling salve from the tin, rendered bear fat and pine resin. Slowly, methodically, he began to work the heavy grease into her skin. He rubbed it into her cuticles, over her thick knuckles, and into the raw meat of her palms. His thumbs pressed deep into the sore muscles at the base of her wrists. The intimacy of it was staggering. Beatrice's breath hitched in her throat. No man had ever touched her with anything but clinical necessity or outright disdain. Gideon's touch was firm, deliberate, and surprisingly gentle. He didn't look up at her face. He looked at her hands as if they were the most important tools in the valley. "They ache," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I'm not used to the work," she whispered. "You work harder than any man I've known," he replied, quietly. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, spreading the warmth of the friction. "You keep this cabin alive, Beatrice. You keep me fed. You keep the fire going." He finally looked up. The firelight cast deep shadows across his bearded face, illuminating the stark silver of his eyes. There was a heat in them that had nothing to do with the hearth. It wasn't a fleeting, polite look. He was taking all of her in, her broad face, her heavy chest under the flannel, the sheer, undeniable reality of her body, and there was no disgust. "Your hands are beautiful," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't kiss her. He didn't push for anything more. He just finished rubbing the salve into her skin, closed the tin, and went back to cleaning his gun. But that night, listening to the crackle of the fire from her bed, Beatrice felt a warmth spreading through her chest that the mountain cold could never touch. The spring thaw turned the mountain into a violent beast of melting ice and rushing water. The snowpack collapsed into the rivers, roaring down the valley and turning the trail into a thick, treacherous river of mud. With the thaw came the reopening of the pass, and with the pass open, the outside world bled back in. It was mid-May when the dog started barking, a frantic, aggressive sound echoing off the timber. Beatrice was at the stove, rendering a block of sweat. Gideon grabbed his rifle and stepped out onto the porch. 3 riders were slogging through the mud toward the cabin. They wore heavy wool coats, but beneath them, Beatrice could see the distinct cut of tailored suits. City men. She wiped her greasy hands on her canvas apron. A cold dread pooled in her stomach. She recognized the lead rider's horse, a fine, nervous roan that had no business in this altitude. The men pulled up to the porch. The leader swung down, his polished leather boots sinking instantly into the muck. He was a sharply dressed man with a thin mustache and eyes like a rat. Mr. Miller, her father's chief surveyor and most ruthless fixer. "Hayes," Miller said, nodding briefly at Gideon before his eyes slid past the giant man and landed on Beatrice, standing in the doorway. A cruel, knowing smirk twisted Miller's mouth. Well, Miss Pendleton, or is it Mrs. Hayes now? I see the wilderness hasn't starved you out. Your father wagered you'd have melted away by now. Seems you found plenty to eat in the woods." The insult hung in the crisp air, nasty and deliberate. Gideon's knuckles turned white on the stock of his rifle. He took a slow, heavy step forward, placing his massive frame between Miller and the door. "State your business on my land, Miller, or get back on your horse." Miller held up his hands in mock surrender, though his eyes remained mean. "Strictly business, Hayes. Cornelius sent me to finalize the right-of-way for the rail line. The ground is soft enough to drive the markers." "My terms were set," Gideon growled. "The line stays to the eastern ridge, away from the timber." "About that," Miller said, pulling a folded map from his coat pocket. "We brought the revised charts. Can we come inside? I'd prefer not to do Pendleton Company business in the mud." Gideon looked back at Beatrice. He didn't order her to step aside. He waited for her to give the silent okay. It was her home, too. She gave a short, stiff nod. Miller and one of his men stomped inside, bringing the smell of stale sweat, wet wool, and cheap cologne into the clean scent of the cabin. They didn't take off their hats. Miller unrolled the map on the rough wooden table. He pointed a gloved finger at a red ink line. "The eastern ridge is too unstable for the grade we need. We're running the line through the center of the valley, right along the river." "That cuts right through my winter grazing," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "And it fouls the water." "It's progress, Hayes," Miller sneered. "Cornelius already filed the addendum in Denver. You signed the original deed, giving us the right of way. You don't dictate the exact path." Gideon glared at the map. He couldn't read well, a fact Beatrice had learned quietly over the winter, reading supply catalogs out loud to him by the fire. Miller knew this. Miller was banking on it. Beatrice walked over to the table. Her boots hit the floorboards with heavy, deliberate thuds. She didn't shrink away from the table. She stepped right up to it, her massive presence forcing Miller to take a half step back. She looked down at the paper. It was covered in surveyor's shorthand, elevation marks, and legal clauses. The language of her father's empire. The language she had spent 24 years quietly absorbing while sitting silently in corner chairs. She traced a thick finger over a cluster of symbols near the bottom corner. "This is a tertiary claim line," Beatrice stated, her voice calm and loud in the small room. Miller blinked. "Excuse me? You're quoting an addendum," Beatrice continued, turning her head to look dead into Miller's rat-like eyes. "But these elevation marks reflect a grade of more than 4%. Pendleton locomotives max out at a 3% grade without a switchback, which you haven't drafted here." She tapped the map hard. "You aren't moving the line for stability, Mr. Miller. You're moving it because the Central Valley has exposed quartz veins, and my father wants to run a secondary mining claim under the guise of a railroad right-of-way, which violates the terms of the land transfer he signed with my husband." Silence slammed into the room. The fire popped violently in the hearth. Miller's face flushed a dark, ugly red. "Listen here, you fat cow." He didn't finish the sentence. Gideon moved faster than a man his size had any right to. One massive hand clamped onto Miller's throat, cutting off his words instantly. He lifted the surveyor an inch off the floorboards and slammed him backward against the log wall. The entire cabin shook. The other suit went for his coat pocket. Gideon didn't even look. He just racked the lever of his rifle with his free hand and pointed the barrel squarely at the second man's chest. The man froze. "You disrespect my wife again," Gideon whispered to the choking man against the wall. "And they won't find enough of you to bury." He dropped Miller. The surveyor crumpled to the floor, gasping for air and clutching his bruised throat. "The line stays on the ridge," Gideon said, his voice like grinding granite. "You try to run a survey stake in my valley, I'll use it to pin you to the dirt. Get out of my house." Miller scrambled up, grabbing his map. He practically sprinted out the door, his hired man right behind him. They threw themselves onto their horses and rode hard back down the muddy trail. Gideon stood by the open door, watching them go until they were swallowed by the timber. He slowly lowered the rifle. He turned around. Beatrice was still standing by the table, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had never spoken to one of her father's men like that. She had never spoken to anyone like that. Gideon walked over to her. The anger had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a profound, burning awe. "You read the grade," he said softly. "I sat in a lot of drawing rooms while my father ignored me," Beatrice replied, her chin trembling slightly. "People talk when they think you're too stupid to understand." Gideon reached out. Both of his large hands cupped her heavy jaw. He ran his thumbs along her cheekbones. "You're a terrifying woman, Beatrice Hayes," he murmured. Beatrice looked up into his pale gray eyes, feeling the sheer strength of the man who stood entirely on her side. "I'm a mountain woman," she corrected him. A slow, brilliant smile broke through Gideon's thick beard. He leaned down and for the first time pressed his mouth to hers. It tasted of wood smoke, coffee, and fierce, unyielding pride. Late August brought a golden, heavy heat to the valley. The high grass turned the color of baked bread. The air smelled of pine resin and ripening berries. Beatrice stood in the river shallows. Her heavy skirts were hiked up and tied off at her thick thighs, the icy water rushing around her calves. She was hauling a woven net full of fat, silver trout. Months ago, the slick stones would have betrayed her balance. Now, her wide feet gripped the riverbed with absolute certainty. She hauled the heavy, wet hemp over her shoulder with a grunt, her thick arms flexing under the hot sun. She heard the horses before she saw them. Not the heavy, rhythmic thud of Gideon's draft team. This was the rapid, unnatural clip of matched carriage horses. She waded to the bank, dropping the net onto the grass. She didn't bother to untie her skirts. She walked barefoot up the slope toward the cabin, the sun drying the water on her skin. A black buggy with gold trim sat awkwardly in the front clearing. The horses were lathered in sweat, their chests heaving in the thin mountain air. Standing on the porch, looking at Gideon's rough-hewn front door with utter disgust, was Cornelius Pendleton. He turned at the sound of her heavy footsteps in the grass. His eyes widened. He took in the wild, loose hair, the tanned skin, the broad, muscular shoulders, and the sheer, unapologetic mass of her. He looked for the cowering, miserable girl he had banished from his parlor. He found a woman who looked like she was carved from the mountain itself. "Beatrice," Cornelius sneered, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority out here under the open sky. "Good God, you look like a savage. Put some shoes on, for pity's sake." Once, that tone would have sent her spiraling into a breathless panic. She would have crossed her arms over her stomach and tried to shrink into the floorboards. Now, Beatrice just felt tired of his voice, tired of his smallness. "You're trespassing, Father," she said. Her voice didn't waver. Cornelius scoffed, pulling a leather folio from beneath his tailored coat. "I own this mountain, Beatrice. Your brute of a husband assaulted my chief surveyor. He voided the contract. I'm here to serve the eviction notice. I brought the sheriff from town to enforce it." A man with a tin star stepped out from behind the buggy. He looked nervously at the thick timber surrounding them, his hand hovering near his holster. The cabin door opened. Gideon stepped out. He wore no shirt, just canvas trousers and leather suspenders over a chest thick with dark hair and sweat. He held a splitting axe in his right hand. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. The sheer threat of his physical presence froze the sheriff in his tracks. Gideon looked at Cornelius, then down at Beatrice. He didn't rush forward to stand in front of her. He walked down the steps and stood beside her, shoulder to heavy shoulder. "Show him, B," Gideon rumbled. Beatrice didn't flinch at her father's glare. She walked past him, her bare feet landing solid and heavy on the dirt steps, and went into the cabin. She returned a moment later with a thick piece of parchment, stamped heavily with the territorial seal. She handed it down to Cornelius. He snatched it, his eyes darting over the dense legal text. The color drained from his sharp face. "What is this?" he hissed. "It's a federal mineral claim," Beatrice said smoothly. "I recognize the ore elevation marks Miller was trying to hide on his new survey map. I wrote to the territorial governor's office in June. As the legal resident and deed holder of this valley, Gideon had first rights to file a subterranean claim. I filed it for him. The quartz under this valley belongs to the Hayes family now. The railroad cannot legally claim eminent domain over an active, registered mine." Cornelius's hands shook. The paper rattled in the quiet air. "You have no idea how to run a mine. You have no capital." "We don't want to mine it," Beatrice said. She crossed her thick arms over her chest, planting her feet wide. "We just wanted to make sure you couldn't touch it. You can build your railroad over the eastern ridge, Father, exactly as my husband instructed. Or you can spend the next decade fighting us in federal court while your investors pull their backing." Cornelius looked at his daughter, really looked at her. The softness was gone, replaced by a dense, unmovable fortitude. The fat he had mocked was the armor she used to survive the winter. The quietness he mistook for stupidity was the trap that had just snapped his empire in half. "You are a terrible disappointment," he whispered, a final venomous attempt to break her. Beatrice smiled. It was a slow, beautiful expression that reached all the way to her eyes. "I know. It's the best thing that ever happened to me." Cornelius stared at her for a long, quiet second. Then he turned, shoved past the nervous sheriff, and climbed back into his black carriage. He didn't look back as the driver whipped the exhausted horses, dragging the buggy back down the muddy trail toward the city. Beatrice watched them go. The silence of the mountain rushed back in, filling the space her father had momentarily tainted. Gideon reached out, his massive, calloused hand wrapped around the thick muscle of her waist. He pulled her flush against his side. She leaned her heavy weight into him, and he took it effortlessly, supporting her just as she supported him. "Federal court," Gideon mused, his pale gray eyes shining with deep amusement. "That's a big threat from a woman who just hauled 40 pounds of trout out of a freezing river." "I like to keep my options open," she murmured, resting her head against his shoulder. He turned her gently, his hands resting on her broad hips. He looked at her with a reverence that made her chest ache in the best possible way. There was no transaction here, no dowry, No settlement, just a man and a woman who had built a life out of wood, fire, and mutual respect. "You are the queen of this valley, Beatrice Hayes," he said, quietly. Beatrice reached up, threading her thick fingers into his beard. "Then let's go inside, my king. The trout needs gutting." High society threw Beatrice away, expecting the brutal mountains to break her. Instead, the Wild West gave her a kingdom, and a mountain man gave her a throne. True love doesn't ask you to shrink. It builds a bigger chair. If this story of Beatrice and Gideon proved that real beauty and strength come in all sizes, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more untamed romance stories.